Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to have an open-ended conversation with Paul Smith. Paul is the founder of the Remote Viewing Instructional Services Company. During his years from 1983 to 1990, with what ultimately came to be known as the Stargate program, he served concurrently as an operational remote viewer, training instructor, unit historian, recruiting officer, and security officer. He was directly trained by Ingo Swann and Hal Putoff, two of the creators of remote viewing, and he was later the main author of the Defense Intelligence Agency Coordinate Remote Viewing Manual. He is also author of two books, Reading the Enemy's Mind Inside Stargate and The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing, the Secret Military Remote Perception Skill Anyone Can Learn. Incidentally, the earlier video conducted with Paul on training remote viewing, which I'm going to link to now if you haven't watched it, it's the single most popular video on the New Thinking Aloud channel. Paul is based in Cedar City, Utah, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Paul. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Well, I'm happy to be here, Jeff. You're one of my favorite people in the universe.
Well, and you are the person who has had the single most popular video on the New Thinking Aloud channel. So you're a very special person in my universe also.
That's purely an accident of fate, I'm sure.
I'm very interested in just having an open-ended conversation with you today. You've been a remote viewing instructor now through your company, Remote Viewing Instructional Services, for decades. And this would be a great time to just sort of reflect back on the whole field of remote viewing. You've been intimately involved with it for a very long time.
That's true, and it gave me the opportunity to actually do something with what I learned in the military, so that's good.
Which is probably a lot more than many veterans can say.
That's true. There's not much call for infantry officers, at least in terms of what their old job used to be, so... The Air Force pilots, they always have something they can fall back on.
Now, I'm guessing that at this point you have trained hundreds, maybe even thousands of people in remote viewing skills.
There's actually a couple of ways of looking at training. Now, if you think in terms of the fully leaded version where we spend hours and days together and they learn it from the ground up, all the nuts and bolts and everything, I've trained hundreds. If you consider introducing people to it, give them the opportunity to try it, teach them at just a very kind of fundamental level, then it would be thousands. So, depending on how you want to calculate that, it's hundreds or thousands. So,
well, that's interesting because in my case, it didn't feel like training at all. It was like I was with Hal and Russ and at SRI, and they just set me down and said, "Here, do it," and I did it. And I never took it any further than that. And I think a lot of people who go through your programs are probably like that. It's very satisfying to know that it's real, to know that it works, but it doesn't mean you're going to become a remote viewer as a profession or even as a sideline.
That's true. Under those circumstances, you kind of give yourself an opportunity to just evaluate it. I tend to divide folks up in terms of what their actual interest in remote viewing is among a couple of categories. There are those who are absolutely dead serious about it. They want to get very fully immersed and involved in it. They want to learn all the ins and outs, the nuances, and learn it in order to use it in some practical way. And a certain percentage of them do that. Then there's the group who want to have an adventure, kind of a consciousness-based adventure, if you will, and do want to kind of get immersed in it and explore it a bit. But once they reach a certain level, they've had their adventure, they move on. And then there's folks who are just basically curious. They want to know, well, does this really work? Is this something that, the mainstream, of course, mainstream science says, no, there's nothing to this. And yet they've seen some provocative results or whatever, or heard some interesting stories. And they say, well, let me just give it a try and see what happens. And so you kind of have those. You've got the very interested and the very committed. You've got the moderately interested, and then you've got the ones who just want to satisfy their curiosity. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with any of those particular motivations. It just depends on what works best for you, yourself, and your life.
Well, of the many people who you've worked with, what percentage do you think actually become professional remote viewers?
I've had several hundred students in the fully leaded versions, for several hundred students. And of those, I'd say about 10% go on to take my intermediate course. So, 90%, the basic course enough, that satisfies them. Now, some of those folks are serious, but life comes along, catches up with them, and they're not able to pursue it to the extent they want to. But roughly 10%, their life circumstances and their interest level are sufficient that they go on and take the intermediate course. And then those who move on to the advanced course are roughly 90% of those, I would say. So once you get through that first wicket of basic, and then you go on to the intermediate, your chances of continuing on are pretty high. You become committed, and you can actually see that there's application here, and it might be a fit for you as a student. And so, and then of those who take the advanced course, I would say maybe half end up doing it professionally in some form or other. Maybe not, certainly not full-time. There's no full-time opportunities for remote viewers, but certainly continue on doing actual operational targets, working for people who want questions answered using remote viewing or whatever. So, yeah, I'd say that's pretty much the percentages, roughly.
It doesn't sound particularly different from many other professions that, let's say athletics. Many people love athletics and engage in athletics on an amateur basis, but in order to participate as a professional, you need to have elite skills.
That's true, and lots of people who develop elite skills don't go on to use them. I mean, I think more in terms of musical performance. There are literally millions of kids who start off playing violin or studying violin or taking lessons in violin or whatever, and they'll do that for years at a time, some of them up until they're adults. And then, of course, they end up on going off on a different tangent. They may have originally had a ambition of becoming some kind of professional musician, but life catches up with them, and even though they have advanced skills, they don't necessarily have the opportunity to apply them. I think of some friends that I had when I was out at Fort Meade. We went to church together. He was actually a cryptographer. He was a mathematician. He had as I recall, a PhD in mathematics, and he was a cryptographer at NSA. And part-time, he played in a local symphony orchestra because he was also a master violinist. So he had both those skills, but the one of them was how he put food on the table, and that was his main calling. And then he did this other thing because he had developed the skill as a child and as a young adult, and he didn't want to lose that, and he wanted to give other people benefit of the work he'd put in.
I guess it's also a question of the marketplace, because I can think of hundreds, thousands of particular applications for remote viewing. For example, a person might want to use it in financial forecasting. The ARV protocol for financial forecasting is, I think, high on a lot of people's horizons. But the market itself requires there to be companies, people willing to invest time and money to make it happen. And I think that if there aren't full-time opportunities for remote viewers, there could be two reasons. One, because remote viewers aren't capable of working full-time any more than a baseball pitcher can pitch full-time. Most of the pitchers pitch a few innings only, and then they need to be replaced. But also, how many clients are out there who are willing to invest in remote viewers?
remote viewing as a profession or a career actually has some of the same limitations as other fields do. So, for example, in fact, we had a gentleman over yesterday. He's a contractor, and we were talking about renovating a couple of our bathrooms, which still date to the late 80s or early 90s. And we got to talking to him. He has a master's in accounting, and when he got his master's degree, there were so many accountants available for the number of jobs that he just went back to contracting, which he'd done to help put himself through school, and found out that was actually probably easier to get work in there than it was as an accountant. So you could be trained in remote viewing, and the demand for remote viewers isn't necessarily as great as the availability of competent people. But there's a further issue, of course. I suspect that the demand for remote viewing would be much higher, and for good remote viewers would be much higher, if it weren't for the fact that, unlike accounting and contracting, which everybody recognizes them as a skill that's beneficial in some way or other, remote viewing, of course, is kind of denigrated or put down by mainstream science, and therefore, and of course, there's this whole set of essentially career skeptics who are trying to quash any public interest in this kind of thing. And so consequently, there are far fewer companies interested in employing remote viewers than could potentially benefit from it over time. And so that unnaturally limits the market for the employment opportunities for remote viewers, just because of a kind of inherent bias, implicit bias in the whole system that doesn't allow people who might benefit from it to actually explore it as a possibility.
In other words, there's still a stigma associated with it.
Mm-hmm. Stigma is a good word here, yes.
Now, you've been engaged in the field since, I think, 1983 or so, that, well over 3 decades. Have you noticed any change in that regard? I mean, when you were in the military, it was largely kept, not entirely, but largely kept under wraps, and maybe the secrecy surrounding the program helped to protect it.
Yes, but it also served to, of course, limit your customer base, right? So in the military, and because it was not just classified from the public, but it was classified, protected from most of the military intelligence world, the potential consumers had to actually know that the program existed and that the skill existed. And that was a very limited set of people who were able to have access to that. Despite the limitations of that set, we actually had a huge demand, relatively speaking. Obviously, we're talking orders of magnitude here, but relatively speaking, we had a huge demand for this. I calculated, Ed May and I have calculated this differently because we have access to different sets of records, but by my calculations, we had about 38 different intelligence entities within the intelligence network that tasked the remote viewers at one time or another to provide information. That's a pretty big, and it's a laundry list of all of the big players, by the way. The one agency that is famous for dissing remote viewing and not wanting to have anything to do with it, the CIA, it turns out they were one of our heaviest customers. So on the surface, they were saying they didn't want to have anything to do with it, but under the table, they were asking us to try and find out stuff for them all the time. So we had a pretty strong client base, in terms of how much actual knowledge there was about what existed out there. I suspect that the same thing might happen commercially ultimately. And it is, of course, the case that most companies aren't even aware of this remote viewing thing. If they have heard of it, they've only heard of it through, some of the sensational claims of a few of the folks out there who tend to want to pursue conspiracy theories or UFO events and that kind of thing. They've heard about it in those terms and think, I don't have any use for that. Or they haven't even heard of it at all, in many cases. So ultimately, maybe as we achieve market penetration, as they say, and some of the more credible work ultimately comes out, which is difficult, of course, because oftentimes the companies that do use remote viewing don't want to talk about it. But nonetheless, I think as that goes over time, we may find that there's a bit more demand for quality remote viewing support.
Well, that must put you kind of in the middle as an instructor of remote viewing. Are you in any way at all active in reaching out to, let's say, the business community or other potential clients to help build more of a market for your students?
Not really. I tend to get solicitations coming my way, and oftentimes they want me to do it. And I much prefer to refer them to other folks who are more actively involved in it. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is that, of course, I'm not getting any younger, and I've got a certain amount of time left, and I don't know what that is, but I don't want to waste any of it. And doing operational remote viewing is actually hugely time demanding. And so I tend to send that off to folks like, I don't know if you've talked to Gail Husick, if you're familiar with her. She has an operation called Husick Group, and she employs roughly 24 remote viewers to solve real-world problems. And she has clients and paying clients, as a matter of fact, and does other stuff pro bono as well. So I will refer them to her, to some other person who I know, who I feel like is doing it right, running operations right, rather than trying to do it myself, because that brings in the second reason. So I'm focused on training. And the reason is because I am older. In fact, all of the original generation of remote viewers are older. Many of them aren't even involved in training anymore because they reached a point where they felt the need to retire. If we were to just do remote viewing operationally and ignore the training, then when we passed on or retired, then remote viewing would go away. So I kind of feel like it's my mission to teach people how to do it so that when we, the old guard, are no longer able to carry on, there will be still people who are actually competently trained, understand the proper processes and ways to go about it, to carry on and to continue the skill on and to provide that ability, that service for people who need it in the future.
Well, you're one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association. It's been functioning now for several decades. As you look at the field as a whole, do you think it's becoming better organized? Do you have a sense of progress?
I think it's more like being on the frontier. Like Kansas in the 1840s, or maybe Colorado in the 1850s or 60s, Arizona or whatever during the Apache Wars. I don't know. It's hard to say. I find the problem is it's kind of a blessing and a curse in a way. People get excited about it, but they come into the field and there's so many voices out there, so many voices sending different messages, singing different tunes and stuff. And it's really hard to sort out what's legitimate from what isn't. And not everything is legitimate. You get people who come in, they've heard the term remote viewing, they know it has something to do with being psychic, they watch a couple of videos and maybe take a class from someone who's taken a class from someone else who's taken a class from somebody who might have known what they were doing. And these folks, they assume that they know all about it, and so they start their own classes, and they start teaching people what they maybe mislearned in the past, or the assumptions they made about paranormal or parapsychology stuff. I mean, there are people who think that channeling is the same thing as remote viewing. There are people who think that that remote viewing is just another name for psychic reading, and so you end up with this huge cacophony of different claims and different stories and different theories and different speculations and stuff. And new people coming in, they kind of don't know where they go. And sometimes they'll get trapped in some of these little whirlpools or eddies of speculation and fantasy and stuff. And I'm afraid that there's gotten to be way too much noise in the remote viewing world right now. Part of the problem, of course, is that basic remote viewing, the fundamental process that we actually use practically and pragmatically, can be a little bit tedious to people who've wanted to go looking for Bigfoot or trying to locate where the actual crashed flying saucers are from Roswell or whatever it might be. I mean, that stuff's way more exciting and way more entertaining than trying to remote view, I don't know, a fiber optics facility in North Carolina or Taiwan or whatever. And the problem is, of course, that the real work with remote viewing isn't the fantasy, isn't the trying to solve who killed JFK, that kind of thing. The real work in remote viewing is trying to solve pragmatic, down-to-earth, real-world problems. And that's just not as exciting as some of this other stuff. And so many folks are coming into the field looking for excitement, not actually for practical use. The one exception is, of course, what you mentioned, the folks who want to use it for investing. You can't afford to employ your imagination or engage in fantasy when you actually have real money on the line. And so those folks are a whole lot more down to earth in the remote viewing techniques and stuff that they practice.
I think it's one of the issues I've noticed with parapsychology in general is it reaches out into the public, even the New Thinking Aloud channel itself, or you might even say the internet itself. The internet tends to, social media, for example, tends to attract people who go in for things that are emotionally arousing. So, for example, conspiracy theories are very popular on the internet, I think, for that reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect remote viewing attracts sometimes some of the same people because it's considered unconventional. It has a sort of glamorous aura surrounding it, and it seems in particular to emphasize the idea that the mainstream culture doesn't buy it. Therefore, it must be true.
Yes, that's true. As you recall, we've done an interview a while back on remote viewing anomaly targets, things like UFO or Bigfoot or whatever, right?
I'll link to that video now, incidentally.
Okay. So, as I mentioned then, one of the reasons remote viewing seems attractive to people for those reasons is because it's something we don't know how it works, but it seems to be able to glean information from targets that we don't have any other access to. And so it's kind of like using a mystery to explore a puzzle, right? When you use remote viewing to try and sort out UFOs, the presumption, and it's a reasonable assumption, the presumption is that remote viewing, because it seems to be independent of time and space, at least to some degree, maybe we can actually get real information about these mysteries, right? But of course, the downside of that is it has to be a real mystery. And while we may actually be able to get information, for example, the Tic Tac UFO incident that's been heavily reported on, that the Navy has documented very thoroughly, remote viewing actually might be useful in that. But if you try and remote view a UFO event that actually may not have ever happened, and not all UFO events were real. They may be just someone's imagination, and they've developed this belief in common culture that they existed. You try to remote view that, you're not going to get any information off of that. So I won't go into everything we talked about in the video right now, but you can understand the motivation for people who may be interested in doing all this and trying to do something with remote viewing in this regard.
I know you've had a close association for a long time with Hal Putoff, and he's one of the people who helped train you. Well, can you talk a little bit about that relationship? In particular, he's been involved in this To the Stars Academy, so he seems to have maintained an interest in propulsion systems relating to UFOs.
Hal has all along had an interest in the advanced physics that UFOs seem to represent, or as they're calling them now, UAPs, right? So, unexplained aerial phenomena, right? Of course, his background is physics. That's where he got started before remote viewing ever came along. And he's fascinated by all of this. He wants to try and reverse engineer some of the phenomena, some of the behavioral characteristics, some of the apparent technology that these UAPs manifest. And so, when the opportunity came along to engage with some folks who really are pretty heavy hitters in the field, which is the To the Stars Academy, the folks that are behind that, his associates there, that was a golden opportunity. He'd been involved in it off and on over time. I can't remember who he's admitted working with. He's worked actually at the government level in this field, for a while back when it was not publicly known. Now he's able to come out in public, at least to some extent, and it's been something he's really been excited about, of course. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. I mean, he gave a talk at a joint conference between the International Remote Viewing Association and the Society for Scientific Exploration back in 2018. And that talk was really revelatory. He emphasized the reality of this phenomenon and the very high likelihood that it is extraterrestrial based on the evidence they have, the very high likelihood that it is real based on the evidence that was developed, and particularly just to indicate there's a lot more than what I'm going to talk about, but this Tic Tac incident that I mentioned, that was the evidence is multispectral. What that means is they had radar data, they had FLIR data, they had visual observation, they had, I don't remember all of it. I mean, they had the Aegis systems on the ships, which is the most advanced air defense system in the world. The Aegis systems on the ships were tracking these objects. They have visual recordings of all of this stuff. It absolutely is real.
What about, you mentioned FLIR?
FLIR.
FLIR, what is that?
Infrared. It's a targeting system, but it's also a detection system. It's a way of looking in the infrared band and collecting information from that. And when you tie the radar data, the FLIR data, the visual systems data, I think they might even use laser ranging on that, I'm not sure. All the different channels of information collection that a modern American battle fleet is capable of developing, they all corresponded and came together, and I can't think of the word I was looking for, but essentially they confirmed one another. And so the evidence doesn't get much better than that for this event that occurred. And so there are skeptics out there who say, oh no, everybody's just misled. That never really happened, or it wasn't what they thought. Those guys are totally wrong. They don't understand the data and the evidence that was developed from that. Very clear evidence that there is something out there that we do not have even an inkling about how it works and why it's here.
Well, I had a hypothesis that I want to run by you since you bring it up, and that is maybe the Navy didn't have an inkling of how it worked, and it was largely the Navy that was tracking it. But what if this were a secret Air Force project, and the Air Force thought they'd spring it on the Navy to see how the Navy would respond to it?
I have worked in those levels, that atmosphere at one time or another, not specifically with the Navy, but I've had access to a lot of the sensor systems. One of the jobs I had was actually at the strategic level, national level, on sensor platforms and stuff. And I've known quite a bit about, special access projects and things where, one arm of the government may not necessarily be aware of what another arm of the military is up to. And yeah, I mean, that's always a reasonable speculation. But the fact is, the way it works, they don't do it that way. And there's good reasons for that. So, for example, what if the Navy decided to try and shoot this thing down, right? That would have been very awkward as far as the Air Force was concerned. But almost always when you have test flights of highly classified systems, you don't tell people who might be, other military elements that might be in the vicinity. You don't tell them what it is you're doing. But there are various restrictions that you level and say you can't be there at this time, you can't do this or that. As far as wanting to test the reactions of the Navy, they wouldn't do it that way. Again, partly because of the reason of there's too much danger of there being some kind of collateral damage. But the other case is the Navy isn't the only ones that are monitoring those. You've got Russian satellites, you've got Russian electronic warfare ships, you've got Russian submarines, you've got Chinese, you've got all these people who may or may not be monitoring that particular carrier group. And those guys are going to have all their stuff up too. And so if you just test the Navy and fly one of these things by, then you're revealing capabilities to the bad guys that you don't want them to know you know. When I say bad guys, our opponents or whatever, our competitors, that's probably a better
Our competitors, it seems to be the word of choice these days.
Yeah, I think that's a good word. So competitors, you're revealing your secrets to them, and that's not a good idea, right? You're showing them capabilities you might have. Usually when they test these kind of things, they do it in a relatively closed environment. They may have all of the same sensors for an Aegis system on land base at like Area 51 or whatever, in an area where the Russians or the Chinese aren't going to be able to pick up on the signatures of the different systems and how they react to your new technology. You do it in a protected environment. That's how they do it. They don't go test it on other branches of the military. So I don't think that's a very likely scenario at all.
Mm-hmm. So
he says with a little skepticism in his voice.
Well, it'd be nice to think that maybe we actually had this technology, but I gather the consensus among many experts who have looked at it is that this is not of this planet.
Yes. Now, there are lots of other theories. Jacques Vallée, for example, thinks that it's trans-temporal, so across time, from the future or whatever. Well, I won't say he thinks that. That's one of his speculative hypotheses, and other people think, well, no, it's comes from one place or another. But in general, the evidence seems to point in an extraterrestrial origin. Wherever that's from, who knows?
So Hal has been deeply involved in looking at this, and I guess he has maintained his relationship with you as far as I know. So he's still also very interested in remote viewing.
Well, he's supportive of it. He's not researching it particularly anymore because he's got his plate full with all this stuff. I mean, Hal is closing in on his mid-80s. And, there's that old joke that says, God put me on earth to do a certain number of things, and at the rate I'm going, I'm never going to die. Right? Yeah. So in Hal Putoff's case, I hope that's true. But yeah, I mean, he's got his finger in a lot of pies, but his main interest right now is this. Now he's also started started up a company with some really, really leading edge technology that he's developed that he has the intellectual property, owns the intellectual property for. And I know what it is, but I don't think I can talk about it. It will be a game changer in certain arenas in our world. And so at the age of, I don't know, I think he might be 84 now. I've lost track how old he is. He's starting a whole new corporation with some, interested investors to exploit this technology. And most people by now are long retired and out fishing or planting a garden or whatever. Not Hal. He's trying to change the world. And to be honest, I haven't actually talked to him in about a month or so because he's so busy. I hate to disturb him. I do actually have some stuff I need to talk to him about, so I'm probably going to call him in the next few days or a week. But nonetheless, he's an amazing guy, and he's got some amazing ideas. And although a lot of the skeptics again kind of dismiss him, they don't know what he's up to. And he's involved in a lot of very important, leading edge work, not just in trying to figure out UFOs, but other things as well.
Hal is very famous, to my knowledge, for his theoretical work on zero-point energy. And even Arthur C. Clarke, when he was alive, the great science fiction writer who was publicly skeptical about ESP, felt that Hal's work in zero-point energy was a game changer.
Yeah, and I don't know the status of that at the moment. The technology I was talking about actually isn't even involved in that. There's so many fields that he has an interest in. So, but yeah, I don't know where they're going with the zero-point energy stuff.
These revelations concerning the Tic Tac UFO and all of the data that has now been collected by the U.S. military about it, undoubtedly it has aroused the interest of a lot of remote viewers. I can well imagine that remote viewers are trying to suss this thing out.
Well, they probably are. I don't know of any specific efforts to do that. And frankly, I don't really care. I'm interested in the phenomenon to some degree, but unless I'm directly asked to be involved, I mean, I've got so many other fish to fry. And the fact is, in the remote viewing world, there's so many different levels and qualities of remote viewers that oftentimes people who go after this as kind of a, hey, I'm interested in this, I'm going to go look into it. those folks tend to be kind of fantasy driven. And so I don't really pay much attention to what they do. It's like the same folks that say, well, we should remote view and see what's going to happen with COVID. Well, you know what? First of all, it's a very hard thing to remote view because you're talking about an undeterminate future. And how would you know what you were looking at even if you did? And second of all, of course, a lot of them are doing it front-loaded. And if you're front-loaded when you remote view, you're just going to booger everything up anyway, because then everything you believe or can guess about it ends up in your head instead of the actual signal. I mean, there's lots of reasons why that's just a bad idea. So, I don't pay much attention to it. If somebody does a credible project on it, then I become interested. But most of the one-off folks that are trying to do it, okay, I'm not interested.
Let me ask you this, Paul. What is exciting you right now? What are the kind of projects that are on the top of your list?
Well, one thing that's going to excite me is when I can actually go back to live teaching again. So once I get the vaccine and it proves to be successful, then I'm going to start up my classes again. And I have a whole huge backload of people who really want to take live training, and I just had to eliminate that for the time being, partly because my own state, Utah, is just going over the top in terms of infections. We got so many people who don't believe it's real, and then all of a sudden they catch it and they discover, oh, maybe it is real, but by then it's too late, right? But there's so many people out there who don't believe anything about COVID. They think it's all a hoax. And oftentimes those are the same folks who believe the earth is flat and believe the moon landing was on a soundstage, So unfortunately, there's a lot of those here in my state, and they're all, spreading it like crazy. And so I just am not able to do the live training, and I'm really looking forward to the point when I can. So that's one thing.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I'm interested in is I'm trying to get back into the field of consciousness. I mean, that was part of my studies in my PhD was philosophy of mind and consciousness, and I think it's an area that I'd like to explore. Now, of course, that's obviously connected with remote viewing, because remote viewing is a consciousness-based experiential activity or skill, or whatever you want to call it. And so they're certainly connected, but I'm branching out a bit more. I'm not branching out. I'm just revisiting where I was years ago, interested in the field of consciousness. I've even listened to some of your interviews on consciousness, right, or folks you've had that are involved in it, and I'm trying to get back into the saddle in that regard, because there's areas to explore that I think remote viewing provides insights for that a lot of folks out there don't recognize, and so hopefully I can kind of bring both of those more together in the world, and maybe find some insights that we don't have yet.
My sense is that the philosophers who are working on the problem of consciousness are very reluctant to take the data of remote viewing seriously.
We'll have to work on them, won't we? Well, you do have to be cautious. To be fair to them, you do have to be cautious. There's lots of wild claims out there, right? But I think that done responsibly, we can start helping them maybe understand, well, there might be a legitimate approach here as long as we do it within the strictures of the scientific method.
Well, we have 138 years of empirical data suggesting that the human mind is capable of accessing information distant in time and space.
And it's not all remote viewing, obviously, of the 138 years.
I think the data at this point is unequivocal. And in fact, I think that in 2 years ago, the American Psychologist, the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, published an article which was a survey of all the meta-analyses in the field, covering some 1,400 experiments in parapsychology, including remote viewing, but many other modalities, and they all point in the same direction. And when you combine the data from all these studies, it's overwhelmingly significant, and the data doesn't lose significance as the experimental methods improve.
That's right. And you'd expect it, if it was a false positive, that the better you got in your research, the less the effect. But that's not what's happened, which astonishes, I think, and dismays some of the skeptics. So you're talking about Etzel Cardenas'
I am indeed. Yeah. I mention it a lot. I think it's a landmark paper. Unfortunately, it's copyrighted. It can't be freely distributed. But if any viewers send an email to me personally at friends@newthinkingaloud.com, I can send them an individual copy of that paper, because I think it's important. If you want, a very clear-cut, scientifically analyzed empirical piece of information looking at 130 some years of data, that would be it.
I think it's great. Now, let me add that what we've got is evidence, a ton of evidence that shows that there is a reality to the phenomenon. The challenge now is to find the evidence that actually can inform us about consciousness. Not just that there is this consciousness experience that involves ESP, but see what we can do with it to help us understand what consciousness itself actually is. Now, I don't know what direction that's going to be, but that's kind of one of the questions that I'd like to see, if we can use the ESP data in general to see if we can shed light on that, because that, of course, is what David Chalmers called the hard problem, and science has made no progress on answering the question that the hard problem represents: what is consciousness?
I would have looked at the hard problem a little different. To me, the hard problem only exists if you're a materialist, which is I always thought the hard problem is, how do you explain consciousness, which is immaterial, from a materialistic perspective? And the answer is you can't. But if you don't start out with the materialistic metaphysics, then the hard problem kind of goes away.
That is actually one strategy. In fact, that was the core direction of my dissertation, was to examine you call materialism, of course, physicalism is a broader term for it, but to establish what the actual foundation of physicalism is, and show that the ESP data, the best attested, most scientifically derived ESP data, undermines that whole premise of materialism, right? The whole premise of physicalism. So that's one strategy, but it actually still leaves an explanatory gap, as Joe Levine described it, and that is, even if we acknowledge that maybe consciousness is not a physical phenomenon, that it's something else, maybe an or existent, something that is of equal level in the ontological nature of as physicalism. So it's a neighbor to physicalism. It's not part of physicalism. Even if that's true, we still have an explanatory gap. We don't know how they integrate. We don't know how a physical system actually has that experientially. And just saying it's non-material or non-physical doesn't answer that question, right? So there's lots of room to dig around and try and see if we can link stuff up here and see if we come up with a solution.
Incidentally, of course, you and I did an earlier interview on physicalism based on your dissertation. I'm going to link to that as well. Our viewers can click in the upper right-hand corner of their screen if they are interested in that earlier discussion we had about it. And you're right, the interface between mind and matter. I personally lean towards Bernardo Kastrup's idealism.
Yeah. And I tend to prefer Kurt Ducasse's solution. Well, he didn't come up with a solution, but he essentially said, you have matter, you have mind, they interact, get over it.
Some things we may never figure out.
Well, that's true. And if you think about it, there's good reason for that, because you're working in two domains that are dramatically, and assuming that ESP is a non-physical, consciousness is non-physical, and the physical domain, you're working two domains that seem to be mutually exclusive, based on what we know. And you cannot use physical measurement to try and identify a non-physical thing. But on the other hand, you can't use a non-physical approach to necessarily delineate and discriminate physical phenomena. It's kind of like two different things, and the trick is to figure out how they come together, how they interact.
And I think we're also limited by Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which the way I understand it is that there is no system, no logical system that is really capable of explaining itself. Every system, in order to explain it, you have to somehow reach outside of that system and look at it from a distance. And since we're using consciousness to explain consciousness, we're up against that limitation.
And a couple of other philosophers have voiced similar, at least in principle, similar things. Bertrand Russell had, had a similar thought problem puzzle that mirrored that. And I'm blanking on the other guy. He's one of the logical positivists, but they've all kind of got their hands around this same issue. And of course it is a problem. So, dealing with that is just yet another facet of this very interesting kind of puzzle we don't know if we'll have a solution to, but it would be fun to explore. And I'm sure we learn a lot of stuff, even if we don't solve the ultimate problem. And learning is what matters here, I think. So.
Well, that's why I do these interviews. And, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the practical career possibilities for people in remote viewing. We've talked about some of the exciting developments in UFOs. We've been talking about consciousness, so we've been jumping around quite a bit. Is there anything else you'd like to cover while I have you with me, Paul?
I mean, I'm trying to get back into watercolor after 40, 50 years of my original training, but I don't think that's germane to our topic here. So,
well, I'm looking at a painting behind you. Is that one of yours?
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple back there. I don't know which ones you can see. Those are oil paintings I did years ago, actually, while I was still in the remote viewing program. One of them I call Psychic Silverware. It represents a whole bunch of bent spoons and forks and stuff that I actually either was present for them or they were provided to me from people I trust, and they're floating in a star field. And in fact, literally, all of those were real. I have the actual implements here in a box here next to my desk. So that was one, trying to capture the mystery of the world. And the other one was just an interesting kind of space art kind of a thing. Interestingly, I kind of picked up my love for that sort of motif from Ingo Swann, who was into a thing he called cosmic art. And, I'd always been kind of interested growing up and taking art classes at Brigham Young and in high school and everywhere else. But I've always been interested in, yes, surrealism. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, I've been interested in surrealism, but I never really liked the nightmare quality of it. And a lot of it is very nightmare. And then through Ingo, I saw him working on his cosmic art. It's just fascinating stuff, really gorgeous. And he also was a fan of René Magritte, who you can definitely see Magritte style kind of get a little bit into Ingo Swann's. And I fell in love with Magritte as well. And so all these years, that was what I wanted, and I didn't know there was a such thing. In fact, there wasn't at the time that I was interested in the surrealism. It's cosmic art is what Ingo called it. And I've gotten and when I do watercolor, I like to do landscape watercolor because I love the beauty of nature and I live in a really gorgeous place here in southern Utah. I just love doing that stuff, but cosmic art, when I get into oils and stuff, that's really where my love is.
I love visionary artwork myself. We have a couple of artists who have submitted their works to New Thinking Aloud, either to sell as a way to raise money for the program or just to distribute in our newsletter. I think it's wonderful artwork. It sort of makes me feel like a larger person just looking at it.
Yes, I think that's what it is. It gives you a feeling that excitement about the universe. I don't know. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but that's kind of it. It's excitement about the universe and exciting about the mysteries and the wonderful things to explore and all that. That's kind of the feeling I had. And yes, I've seen some of the artwork in your house. There's some just spectacular stuff there. Very impressive.
Well, Paul Smith, it's been a great pleasure to have this time with you. You really become an iconic figure in the world of remote viewing, and I hope that we can have many more conversations, that we both live long enough to keep the conversations going.
Yes, I absolutely look forward to that, Jeff. You help me. You're helping me stay young because I have to keep my brain working to be able to keep up with you and the questions you ask.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for being with me today.
You are quite welcome, and I look forward to the next time.
And for those of you watching or listening, thank you for being with us.